Your mother filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against me using your name, and now I need to fire you to protect the company." These were the words that came out of my boss's mouth on a Tuesday morning that would completely change the course of my professional and personal life forever. I was sitting at my desk, strategically positioned near the window on the 12th floor of the mirrored commercial building where the digital marketing company I had worked for 4 years as a senior project coordinator operated, slowly sipping my still steaming morning coffee from a navy blue mug with the company logo and meticulously organizing the day's tasks in my electronic planner, when Ricardo appeared walking hurriedly down the central corridor of the open office, with an expression of deep embarrassment and palpable nervousness I had never seen etched on his 45 years of solid and unwavering business experience. The office was bustling as always on busy Tuesday mornings, with the constant familiar hum of urgent phone calls echoing through the partitions, printers working at an accelerated pace creating a mechanical symphony of productivity, animated conversations between colleagues from different departments about ongoing projects, tight deadlines, and advertising campaigns requiring immediate attention. But in that specific and terrifying moment, everything around me seemed to pause as if someone had pressed a universal pause button when I heard these incomprehensible and devastating words coming from the mouth of the man who had always been extremely respectful, professional, and cordial with me during all these years of harmonious and productive work together. The office air conditioning continued to hum monotonously. The fluorescent lights remained shining with their relentless artificial clarity. The computers continued processing infinite data, but my mind simply categorically refused to process what he was saying with an expression of genuine suffering stamped on his normally confident face. How could my mother have filed a sexual harassment lawsuit using my name without my knowledge or consent? How could I be getting fired immediately for something I didn't even know had happened, and that seemed to come out of an absurd nightmare? The coffee I was holding with excessive force trembled violently, as if an internal earthquake was shaking my body. Some dark and bitter drops uncontrollably dripping onto the important documents neatly spread across the oak desk, while I desperately tried to find coherent words to respond to a situation that seemed extracted directly from a poorly crafted suspense film where the protagonist discovers that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. My throat closed as if an invisible hand were squeezing my neck. My heart began to beat erratically against my chest like an out-of-rhythm drum, and I felt a wave of heat rise through my face while reality began to distort around me like a mirage in the desert. "Mr. Ricardo, I don't understand absolutely anything you're talking about at this moment," I managed to murmur with a voice that came out much weaker and more trembling than I intended, my green eyes widening with genuine surprise and growing terror as I observed his expression of profound discomfort. He sighed deeply like someone carrying the weight of the world on his broad shoulders, nervously running his hand through his dark hair already marked by some premature gray strands that witnessed years of intense business responsibilities, and handed me with careful gestures an official brown leather folder with the embossed gold logo of the Mendes & Associates labor law firm that I didn't even know existed in our relatively small city. His hands, normally firm and confident during important meetings and presentations for demanding clients, trembled slightly as he placed the folder on my desk, as if the simple act of giving me those documents was a painful betrayal against everything our respectful professional relationship had represented during all these years of harmonious collaboration and exceptional results. Inside the folder were legal documents printed on official letterhead with my full name, Marina Oliveira Santos, written in capital letters that seemed to scream accusations, my signature falsified in a surprisingly convincing manner on multiple pages, and detailed and disturbing descriptions of supposed episodes of sexual harassment that never happened anywhere in our strictly professional, respectful, and cordial relationship that always guided our daily interactions in the corporate environment. It was as if someone with intimate knowledge of my professional life had meticulously created a sinister parallel reality where I was the victim of horrific sexual crimes that I never witnessed nor experienced, where my professional life had become an unbearable hell of constant humiliations and systematic embarrassments that existed only in the sick and disturbed imagination of whoever crafted those lies with surgical precision. The initial reading of the documents was a surreal and terrifying experience that made me seriously question my own mental sanity, because each carefully written paragraph described specific and detailed situations with precise, carefully selected dates, meticulously documented exact times and circumstances, elaborated with rich details that had supposedly happened between myself and Ricardo during the last 2 years of working together. The official paper felt rough between my trembling fingers. The smell of fresh ink invaded my nostrils, and each word typed in Times New Roman size 12 seemed to jump from the page to physically assault me with its invented cruelty. According to the stamped and filed official papers, he had made inappropriate and degrading sexual comments during private meetings in his office with the door closed, sent text messages with explicit sexual content to my personal cell phone during inappropriate hours, touched intimate parts of my body during supposed casual conversations in the hallway near the water cooler, and had even tried to force me into compromising sexual situations in exchange for salary promotions and substantial increases that I never received nor requested at any point in my career. Each documented accusation was more absurd, fantastical, and mendacious than the previous one, because I perfectly remembered every significant conversation I had with Ricardo in the last 4 years of working together, since my hiring as a junior assistant until my recent promotion to senior coordinator, and all were always extremely professional, respectful, focused exclusively on issues related to the work we developed together in the company, and conducted with witnesses present or in completely open and monitored environments. Ricardo always treated all company employees, regardless of gender, age, or hierarchical position, with exemplary equality and unconditional respect, maintaining appropriate distance and acting strictly in accordance with all corporate conduct norms that any serious and well-managed company should religiously follow to maintain a healthy and productive work environment. During important meetings with demanding clients, he always maintained impeccable professional posture, appropriate corporate language, and never made personal comments about employees' physical appearance or private life. On occasions when we needed to work late to meet tight deadlines or resolve unexpected crises, he always made sure that other colleagues were present in the office, offered safe transportation home, and kept conversations strictly focused on ongoing projects. There was never even an ambiguous comment that could be misinterpreted, a malicious or inappropriate look that made anyone feel uncomfortable, an inappropriate physical gesture that violated someone's personal space, or any questionable behavior that could be remotely interpreted as harassment by anyone minimally rational, honest with themselves, and committed to the truth. His interactions with me were always marked by professional cordiality, constructive feedback on my performance, genuine recognition for my exceptional results, and constant encouragement for my professional growth through courses, seminars, and leadership opportunities that he personally recommended to accelerate my career. "This is completely insane and surreal," I said aloud to break the tense and suffocating silence that had settled in the room like a toxic fog, my voice echoing off the gray fabric. Covered walls, while Ricardo observed me with a profound expression of genuine sadness and absolute helplessness that clearly demonstrated that he too was being an innocent victim of this absurd and unfair situation that someone had maliciously orchestrated against both of us. His normally erect and confident posture was slightly curved by the emotional weight of the situation. His broad shoulders that used to carry business responsibilities with confidence now seemed overwhelmed by a much heavier and more personal burden. "Mr. Ricardo, I swear by my personal and professional honor, by the sacred memory of my grandparents who raised me with solid values of honesty and integrity, that I never witnessed any of these horrible situations described here with such disturbing details. This is all pure lies, all maliciously invented by someone who has serious psychological problems in their head and who is using our respectful professional relationship as a tool for some sick plan." My indignation was growing exponentially with each passing second like a fire fed by strong wind, transforming the initial paralyzing shock into pure and justified anger against whoever had orchestrated this elaborate and cruel farce that was systematically destroying my promising career and the impeccable reputation of an upright man who dedicated his professional life to building a company based on solid ethical principles and mutual respect. The air in the room seemed to be becoming denser and more difficult to breathe, as if the environment itself was reacting to the gravity of the situation unfolding. The decorative plants on the shelves seemed to symbolically wilt. The motivational pictures on the walls sounded ironically empty, and even the natural light entering through the panoramic window seemed to have lost its usual vitality, creating an oppressive atmosphere that perfectly reflected the professional nightmare that was materializing before our incredulous eyes. Ricardo sat heavily in the ergonomic chair in front of my desk, his movements slow and calculated like those of someone trying to process devastating information. Carefully removed the prescription glasses he used to work long hours on complex spreadsheets and detailed reports, and massaged his temples with tired, repetitive gestures of someone who had spent the entire night without sleeping properly, probably tossing in bed trying to find a solution to a situation that seemed to have no logical or fair way out. His hands, which I had always seen demonstrating confidence when signing important contracts or greeting influential clients, now trembled slightly with the vulnerability of someone who suddenly found himself attacked by accusations that could destroy decades of honest work and unwavering business dedication. "Marina, I know with absolute certainty that you did not make this terrible complaint," he said with a voice deeply laden with emotional and physical exhaustion that echoed through the silent room, his normally bright dark eyes demonstrating an oceanic sadness that made me feel a sharp pang of irrational guilt, even though I rationally knew that I had no responsibility for what was happening to our lives. The fluorescent light of the office created dramatic shadows on his normally optimistic face, accentuating lines of worry that seemed to have appeared overnight. "I've known you for 4 intense and productive years. I know your unwavering character, your crystal. Clear honesty that shines through in every decision you make. Your impeccable professional ethics that you demonstrate daily through concrete actions and exceptional results. I know you would never invent horrible lies about sexual harassment that never happened, nor could happen in our respectful work environment." He took a long, contemplative pause, looking through the panoramic office window to observe the hypnotic movement of the city below, where ordinary people lived their normal lives without suspecting the drama unfolding 12 floors above their heads, before continuing with a detailed explanation that would make my carefully constructed world completely collapse like a house of cards hit by a hurricane. "The devastating problem is that the complaint was filed by someone who convincingly identified themselves as your official legal representative, using an apparently legitimate power of attorney with your signature notarized by a respected notary, and presenting documents that seem extremely convincing and legally sound to any experienced lawyer or discerning judge who analyzes the case superficially without deep investigation." My stomach violently turned as if I had ingested something toxic when I gradually began to understand the frightening magnitude of what was being meticulously plotted against me and my innocent boss. Because someone with privileged access to my most intimate personal information had forged official documents with my personal signature, created a legally convincing but completely fraudulent power of attorney, and used my respected name as a weapon of destruction against the life of an innocent man who always treated me with exemplary respect and genuine professional consideration during all the years of our fruitful collaboration. The implications of the situation began to expand in my mind like concentric waves in a lake, each new understanding bringing additional horror about the sophistication and malice of the plan someone had devised against us. Who would be capable of doing such a thing with such coldness and calculation, Mr. Ricardo? Who would have privileged access to my most intimate personal information and be sufficiently crazy, disturbed, or malicious to invent such elaborate and legally convincing lies? I asked desperately with a failing voice, but in the darkest depths of my heart, a terrible and unbearable suspicion was beginning to form like a dark storm cloud that threatened to completely devastate the emotional landscape of my family life. The suspicion that was silently germinating in my subconscious like a poisonous seed exploded into absolute and devastating certainty when Ricardo carefully mentioned the name of the person who had made the criminal complaint in my name, his low and hesitant voice demonstrating that he perceived the extreme delicacy of the information he was about to reveal. The office around us continued functioning normally, with colleagues typing on their computers, answering phones, and discussing projects. But for me, it was as if a bubble of deadly silence had formed around our conversation, isolating us from the real world while my personal reality imploded. The woman who convincingly presented herself as your authorized legal representative is called Cecilia Maria Oliveira Santos, emphatically claimed to be your biological mother, and demonstrated detailed and intimate knowledge about your daily work routine, your specific arrival and departure times, your team colleagues by full name, and even about specific confidential projects that you have coordinated here at the company for years, he explained with extreme care, as if each word was a bomb that could explode and cause irreparable collateral damage. And each syllable was like a brutal stab in my heart that was already broken by the family betrayal that was slowly revealing itself before my incredulous eyes brimming with contained tears. My mother's name echoed through the room like a cannon shot, reverberating off the walls and creating ghostly echoes that seemed to laugh at my naivety. Cecilia Maria Oliveira Santos, my 58-year-old mother who lived with apparent moral rigidity, the woman who carried me in her womb for 9 months, who gave birth to me on a rainy March morning, who should have been my first line of defense against all the evils of the world, who should have protected me unconditionally against any form of injustice or cruelty, had deliberately decided to destroy my promising professional career with elaborate and legally sophisticated lies that could ruin not only my carefully constructed life, but also the exemplary life of an innocent man who had never harmed anyone throughout his existence, dedicated to honest work and family. The discovery was so shocking and incomprehensible that I felt my vision dangerously darkening at the edges, as if I were about to faint right there in the office swivel chair, while trying to mentally process the unimaginable cruelty and calculating malice necessary to architect such a destructive, perverse, and potentially devastating plan for all people innocently involved in the situation. My own mother. How is it humanly possible that my own mother, the woman who taught me the difference between right and wrong, is capable of doing something like this to me? I murmured to myself with total incredulity, the words coming out almost inaudible because my throat was completely closed by the overwhelming emotion that dominated me like an emotional storm, making my entire body tremble with the force of an internal earthquake. Ricardo observed my reaction with genuine concern, etched in every feature of his normally serene face, probably perceiving through my expression of growing horror that I was discovering something terrible and unacceptable about my own family. Something that would forever and irreversibly change the way I saw the woman who raised me, educated me, and who theoretically should have been my greatest source of unconditional support in life. The air conditioning continued functioning monotonously, but I felt excessive heat rising through my body like fever. My hands were cold and sweaty, and my heart was beating so hard that I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears like war drums announcing a battle I never wanted to fight. Marina, do you have any specific idea why your mother would do something so extreme and destructive? Is there any recent family conflict that might explain such a drastically inappropriate and legally dangerous attitude? He asked with extreme delicacy, his soft voice contrasting with the brutality of the situation. But I merely shook my head negatively in a mechanical way because I was still in a state of total shock, and my mind refused to accept the reality that was unfolding before me. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fit together in my mind like a horror movie being played in slow motion, when I remembered with increasing clarity apparently innocent and casual conversations I had recently had with my mother about my professional life, conversations that at the time seemed to me just normal and healthy maternal curiosity, but which now took on a sinister, manipulative, and deeply disturbing significance in light of this devastating revelation. The office around us seemed to be dissolving like a watercolor in the rain, colleagues' voices becoming distant and unreal, while my mind worked frantically to reconnect seemingly disconnected memories into a pattern that finally made sense in a terrifying way. In the weeks leading up to this catastrophe, Cecilia had shown excessive and almost obsessive interest in my specific work schedules, asking detailed and insistent questions about meetings with superiors that seemed like disguised investigations, about work trips I occasionally needed to make for important clients, and especially about my specific relationship with male colleagues, including specifically Ricardo, whom she knew only by name through my casual and unconcerned reports about day-to-day office life and interesting projects we developed as a team. During phone calls that I now realize were disguised interrogations, she would ask with suspicious insistence about exact times of my meetings, who would be present, where they would take place, how long they would last, and always showed particular interest when I mentioned any interaction with Ricardo, even the most banal and professional ones. When I enthusiastically talked about challenging projects he assigned to me, she would make subtle yet venomous comments about how male bosses always have ulterior motives with young and attractive female employees, or how you're too naive to realize when you're being manipulated by older, experienced men. At the time, I interpreted these comments as generational conservatism, typical of a woman of her age and traditional background. But now I understand they were seeds of paranoia she was systematically planting to justify the horrific actions she was already secretly planning. She had always been a controlling woman who tried to interfere in every aspect of my adult life with irritating persistence, from my romantic relationships to my most personal financial decisions. But I never imagined in my worst nightmares that her sick need for control could reach the extreme point of inventing non-existent sexual crimes to force me to leave the job I passionately loved and where I was building a solid, promising, and financially independent career. She wants me to move back in with her and financially depend on her again. I suddenly realized with the devastating clarity of lightning illuminating a nighttime landscape and revealing monsters hidden in the darkness, the truth hitting my mind like an apocalyptic revelation connecting all the scattered dots of the situation. The understanding came like an emotional avalanche that left me breathless, making me comprehend that I was the victim of an elaborate and cruel psychological manipulation that had probably lasted entire years. A manipulation that had now escalated to serious legal crimes that could have devastating and irreversible consequences for all innocent people involved in the situation. She never really accepted that I became an independent and financially autonomous woman, never could bear to see me happy and professionally fulfilled away from her suffocating influence, never tolerated that I built my own life where she wasn't the absolute center of all decisions. So she created this criminal situation to force me to resign and become financially dependent on her again, like when I was a teenager. The revelation made me feel profound nausea of disgust and uncontrollable anger, because I finally understood with crystal clarity that I was the victim of a sophisticated psychological manipulation that had begun in my childhood and gradually intensified over the years. A manipulation that had now transformed into federal crimes that could destroy innocent lives just to satisfy the sick control needs of a woman who confused maternal love with toxic possessiveness. Ricardo observed my expression gradually change from paralyzing shock to growing understanding and then to pure and justified indignation, probably perceiving through my facial expressions that I was connecting important dots about the sinister psychological motivation behind this elaborate and legally dangerous farce. His own features reflected a complex mixture of relief at having an explanation for the nightmare that had descended upon our company, genuine sadness at seeing an exemplary employee discovering devastating family betrayals, and paternal concern for my emotional well-being in the face of such traumatic revelations about my own mother. The office continued functioning around us with its relentless routine of capitalist productivity, but our small bubble of personal drama seemed to exist in a parallel dimension where time had stopped to allow us to process the magnitude of the discoveries that were changing our lives forever. Marina, I can see that you're beginning to understand the motivations behind this terrible situation, he said softly, his voice loaded with genuine compassion and professional concern that clearly demonstrated why he had earned the respect and loyalty of all the company's employees through years of ethical and humane leadership. Mr. Ricardo, I need to resolve this situation immediately and definitively, because I won't allow my mother to destroy your impeccable reputation and my promising career with lies that only exist in her sick mind. I declared with an iron determination that surprised even myself, rising from my chair with decisive movements and beginning to pace back and forth across the room while my mind worked frantically like an overloaded computer to find an immediate and effective solution to the nightmare that had suddenly installed itself in my professional and personal life. The adrenaline was running through my veins like incandescent liquid fire, transforming the initial paralyzing shock into pure energy, directed toward the immediate action that the situation desperately required if we wanted to avoid irreversible damage to all innocent people involved. My steps echoed across the laminated office floor, creating an urgent rhythm that perfectly mirrored my growing determination to directly confront the source of all this destruction. I'm going to her house right now at this very moment, and I'll categorically demand that she withdraw this lying complaint immediately, before it causes more irreversible and potentially permanent damage to all of us. I continued speaking with absolute conviction, grabbing my brown leather purse and car keys with decisive and precise movements that demonstrated my unwavering resolution to face this situation head-on, without hesitation or fear of consequences. Ricardo tried to calm me down with paternal gestures and careful words, diplomatically suggesting that I consult an experienced lawyer before taking any precipitous action that could further complicate an already extremely delicate situation. But I was too determined by justified indignation to listen to advice of caution in that moment of controlled but intense fury. Blood pulsed in my temples like war drums, and each second of delay seemed like an eternity where more damage could be caused to the reputation of innocent people. Marina, I perfectly understand your justified indignation and your urgent need for action, but you need to think strategically about how to approach this delicate situation. If your mother was capable of falsifying official documents and inventing such elaborate and legally convincing lies, she might be much more dangerous and unpredictable than you imagine, he warned with genuine concern in his voice, his words carrying the weight of experience from someone who had faced complex business situations throughout decades of career. His words made me pause for a crucial moment, creating a fissure in my impulsive determination, because he was absolutely right about the need for caution when dealing with someone who had demonstrated surprising capacity for sophisticated manipulation and fraud at levels that surpassed any behavior I would consider normal or predictable. You are absolutely right. I need to prepare adequately and strategically before confronting her directly. But I won't let this situation drag on for longer than absolutely necessary to protect everyone involved, I replied after taking several deep breaths. forcing myself to think more rationally and calculatedly about the critical next steps I should take to resolve this family nightmare that had transformed into a professional and legal crisis of devastating proportions. The office around us continued its symphony of normal productivity, phones ringing, printers operating, conversations about projects. But our reality had become surreal, as if we were living in a parallel dimension where the normal rules of family and professional life had been suspended by an invisible evil force. The trip to the house where I grew up was an indescribable emotional roller coaster that lasted the longest and most distressing 25 minutes of my adult life. As I drove through the familiar streets of the city with hands gripping the steering wheel, as if it were an anchor in the emotional storm that raged inside my chest, obsessively thinking about how to confront my mother about the serious crimes she had committed against me and Ricardo without completely losing emotional control. Each red light was a torturous eternity of growing anxiety where my mind created increasingly dramatic scenarios of the confrontation to come, each familiar curve of the path painfully reminding me of precious childhood moments when I blindly trusted the woman who had now become my declared enemy through actions that betrayed all basic principles of genuine maternal love and fundamental family honesty. The car radio played soft popular music that grotesquely contrasted with the emotional storm raging inside me, and I turned off the sound so I could concentrate on the thoughts spinning in my head like a hurricane of confusion, anger, and deep sadness. The residential neighborhood where my parents had lived for more than 30 years was quiet and peaceful on that sunny Tuesday morning, with only a few small children playing cheerfully in well-kept yards and some retirees watering ornamental plants in their impeccably maintained gardens, creating an atmosphere of idyllic suburban normalcy that dramatically contrasted with the devastating emotional storm raging inside my chest like a volcano about to erupt. The family homes looked exactly the same as always. Red roofs shining under the morning sun, flowering gardens displaying vibrant spring colors, clean sidewalks where I had learned to ride a bicycle decades ago. But now all of that caused me a disturbing sensation of profound estrangement, as if I were visiting the preserved scene of a crime that had not yet been fully revealed or understood in all its horrible dimensions. I carefully parked the blue car in front of the red brick house with a flowering garden where I had spent my innocent childhood and rebellious adolescence, and remained seated for several long, contemplative minutes trying to gather emotional courage and psychological strength to face the woman who gave me life, but was now trying to destroy my professional future with elaborate lies that could have devastating consequences for several innocent people. The house looked exactly the same as always: freshly painted blue gate, low wooden fence where my father planted seasonal flowers, rose bushes that Cecilia religiously tended to every day with obsessive dedication, the covered porch with rocking chairs where she liked to sit on hot afternoons to observe the neighborhood activity and comment on the lives of passing people. But now all of that caused me a profound sensation of estrangement and displacement, as if I were seeing for the first time a place that had been fundamental in shaping my personality and values. The happy memories of playing in the garden, family lunches on Sundays, birthday parties celebrated with genuine joy, were now being contaminated by the devastating discovery that the woman who created all these precious memories was capable of calculated cruelty and criminal manipulation that I would never have imagined possible. How will I manage to maintain calm and rationality when looking directly into her eyes, knowing exactly what she did against me and against an innocent person? I questioned myself anxiously aloud in the stifled silence of the car, observing through the window fogged by my anxious breathing the familiar silhouette of the woman moving through the kitchen with precise and routine movements, probably preparing lunch with the same meticulous domestic routine she had maintained for decades, completely oblivious to the hurricane of consequences that her criminal actions had unleashed in the lives of people she should protect and love unconditionally. I walked slowly through the flowering garden to the familiar front door, each step on the path of irregular stones being an intense mental preparation for the confrontation that I intuitively knew would be one of the most difficult and emotionally devastating of my life, because I would be facing not just a criminal who had committed legally punishable acts, but also the woman who taught me to walk with infinite patience, to speak with maternal affection, and to dream of a better future through inspirational stories told before bedtime. The garden was in full spring bloom, with red roses displaying perfect petals, white daisies dancing gently in the morning breeze, and the sweet smell of jasmine floating in the air like a natural perfume that immediately transported me to childhood memories when everything was simple, safe, and predictable. I touched the golden doorbell with trembling fingers that betrayed my growing anxiety, hearing the familiar sound echo through the house along with Cecilia's hurried and characteristic footsteps approaching to answer, probably curious about who would be visiting at a time when I should be productively working at the office, fulfilling my normal professional routine that she had destroyed with her criminal actions and elaborate lies. When the solid wooden door slowly opened, revealing the familiar face, and our gazes met across the threshold of the house where I had grown up, I saw an initial expression of genuine surprise in her brown eyes that I knew so well, quickly followed by an automatic maternal smile that now seemed completely fake, theatrical, and manipulative to me, like a carefully constructed mask to hide much darker and more controlling intentions. She was wearing a light blue floral dress with long sleeves that I remembered from other family occasions. Her gray hair was tied in a simple but elegant bun that demonstrated her constant concern with social appearances, and her hands smelled intensely of aromatic spices from the kitchen where she was preparing an elaborate meal, creating a perfectly convincing image of a loving grandmother and dedicated homemaker that completely contrasted with the terrifying reality of the manipulative, lying, and potentially dangerous woman that I now knew she really was behind this carefully maintained facade. "Marina, my dear daughter, what a wonderful and unexpected surprise. What are you doing here at this time of the morning? Shouldn't you be at work fulfilling your professional responsibilities?" she asked with a sweet and syrupy voice that made me feel physically nauseous with disgust and indignation because I knew exactly and precisely why I wasn't at work at that devastating moment of my life. "I need to talk to you about an extremely serious and urgent situation, Mother," I replied with a controlled voice that required all my mental and emotional self-control not to immediately explode in shouts of justified indignation right there on the doorstep where so many innocent family conversations had taken place over the years. My voice sounded strangely formal and distant, as if I were speaking to a stranger instead of the woman who raised me, and I realized that I was unconsciously already creating emotional distance as a psychological protection mechanism. She invited me in with apparently affectionate and hospitable gestures, offering fresh coffee and homemade cookies as she always did when I visited her, maintaining the elaborate performance of a loving and welcoming mother. But each gesture of traditional hospitality now sounded to me like a meticulously rehearsed theatrical piece to hide her true criminal and destructive nature that had revealed itself so brutally and unexpectedly. The living room where so many important family conversations had taken place over the years, discussions about school, plans for the future, romantic relationships, professional decisions, now seemed like an improvised courtroom where I would simultaneously be merciless prosecutor, impartial judge, and key prosecution witness against the woman who gave birth to me, but who had betrayed all basic principles of genuine maternal love. The family photographs on the shelves seemed to watch me with silent accusation. The familiar furniture that I had seen thousands of times now seemed strange and threatening, and even the characteristic smell of the house, a mixture of household cleaning, fresh flowers, and homemade food, now caused me physical discomfort instead of the feeling of safety and belonging that I had always felt in this environment. Cecilia carefully settled into her favorite floral fabric armchair, the same one where she used to tell me enchanting stories when I was an innocent child, and observed me with that performative maternal interest expression that I knew so well through decades of coexistence, but that I now perceived to be just an elaborate mask to hide much darker, controlling, and potentially destructive intentions than I had ever imagined possible from someone who should love me unconditionally. That man was clearly interested in you in an inappropriate and predatory way. I saw by the ways you talked about him with so much enthusiasm, by the overtime you constantly worked, by how your eyes sparkled when you mentioned projects he gave you. An experienced mother notices these subtle things that naive daughters cannot identify. Her paranoid and completely distorted accusations made me realize with terrifying clarity that I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality, someone who created elaborate imaginary narratives to justify criminal and destructive behaviors that caused real suffering to innocent people. The familiar room where so many precious memories had been created now seemed contaminated by the revelation that one of the most important people in my life was capable of such profound and dangerous delusions. "Mom, you're completely delusional. Ricardo has always been extremely professional with me. There was never anything beyond a respectful and productive working relationship," I replied with growing exasperation that occasionally made my voice falter, desperately trying to make her see the fundamental difference between objective reality and subjective paranoia. But I quickly realized I was wasting my precious time and emotional energy on someone who had consciously chosen to live in an elaborate fantasy where she was the brave heroine protecting a helpless daughter from sexual predators that existed only in her disturbed imagination. The clock on the wall kept marking time with its hypnotic ticking, but each second that passed in that surreal conversation made me feel as if I were sinking in emotional quicksand. She continued insisting on her conspiracy theories about non-existent harassment with an absolute conviction that gave me chills of fear, creating elaborate details about situations that never happened, demonstrating an impressive and terrifying capacity for elaborate lying and systematic self-delusion that made me seriously question her mental health and her ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. You've always been very naive since you were little, Marina. Since childhood, you trusted people too much. Couldn't perceive when they were taking advantage of you or manipulating your emotions, she said with an unwavering conviction that sent icy shivers of terror through me because I realized she truly believed deeply in her own lies with the intensity of someone who had completely convinced herself of an alternative version of reality. Her words carried decades of distorted observations about my personality, transforming qualities that I considered positive, such as trust and openness, into weaknesses that justified her destructive interference. When you told me about those private meetings with him, about the messages he sent, about the comments he made about your appearance and competence, I immediately knew I needed to act quickly to protect you from something terrible that was developing. Every word coming out of her mouth was a complete distortion of innocent conversations we had had about my work, conversations where I mentioned normal professional meetings, appropriate corporate emails, and proper compliments that any competent boss would give to a dedicated and efficient employee. She had taken scattered fragments of reality and methodically transformed them into a horror narrative that existed only in her disturbed mind. A narrative that was now being used to justify real crimes against innocent people who had nothing to do with her paranoid fantasies. The mental process she had used to transform normal situations into imaginary sexual scandals was so complex and systematic that it made me question whether I was dealing with someone who had completely lost the ability to distinguish between reality and imagination, or if she was simply a calculating manipulator who used paranoia as a tool of control. Mom, you need urgent psychological help. You're inventing things that never happened, creating false memories of conversations we never had, I exclaimed desperately, my voice echoing through the room with a mixture of frustration and genuine concern for her mental health. But she just shook her head with that superior and condescending expression of someone who believes they know more than everyone around them, including objective reality itself. But the conversation dragged on for 2 more exhausting and emotionally devastating hours, during which I tried in every imaginable way possible to make Cecilia understand the absolute gravity of the crimes she had committed and convince her to immediately withdraw the false accusation before it caused irreversible and potentially permanent damage to all the innocent people involved in this tragedy she had created. I used carefully constructed logical arguments, desperate emotional appeals that came straight from the heart, legally, grounded threats about the criminal consequences of her actions, and even humble and painful pleas. But she remained unyielding in her position that she had done the morally right thing to protect me from imaginary dangers that only existed in the distorted landscape of her paranoid mind. The clock on the wall continued marking the hours with its relentless precision, but time seemed suspended in that room where my understanding of my own family was being completely demolished and painfully reconstructed. Each additional minute of the discussion more deeply convinced me that I was dealing with someone who had completely lost the fundamental ability to distinguish between objective reality and subjective fantasy. Someone who had constructed an elaborate and internally consistent narrative where she was the brave heroine, saving a defenseless daughter from sexual predators who existed nowhere except in her sick and disturbed imagination. The sun had moved considerably across the sky during our conversation, creating new patterns of light and shadow throughout the room, but the emotional atmosphere remained dense and oppressive, charged with the tension of revelations that were irreversibly changing the dynamics of our family relationship. Marina, you will thank me one day for having the courage and wisdom to do what you couldn't do for yourself, she said at the end of the conversation with an absolute and terrifying conviction that made me feel chills of terror as I realized I would never be able to change her mind through rational arguments or emotional appeals. I left my parents' house with the devastating and permanent feeling that I had forever lost the mother I thought I had, discovering in her place a manipulative and potentially dangerous stranger who was willing to destroy innocent lives to satisfy her sick needs for absolute control over my existence. The flowery garden that had given me so much pleasure upon arrival now seemed withered and threatening. The flowers seemed to have lost their vibrant colors, and even the sweet smell that had previously transported me to happy memories now caused me nausea from association with the horrible discovery I had made about the true nature of the woman who raised me. The journey back home was a journey through a dark and seemingly endless emotional tunnel, where I cried bitter tears of justified anger, profound disappointment, and genuine grief for the symbolic death of the woman who gave birth to me, but who had now become my worst enemy through actions that betrayed all basic principles of maternal love. Driving through the familiar streets of the city with vision blurred by tears of pain that seemed to have no end or possible cure, I felt as if I were navigating through a completely transformed landscape where nothing would make sense in the same way again. How will I explain to Ricardo that my own mother is a criminal who invented lies about him? How will I rebuild my professional life after this family catastrophe that destroyed everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me? I thought anxiously, the questions echoing in my mind like a chorus of desperate voices searching for answers that didn't exist. The outside world continued functioning normally. People walking on sidewalks, cars passing in their daily routines, the sun shining with indifference upon the personal tragedy that had befallen my life. But I felt completely disconnected from this normal reality, as if I were living in a parallel dimension where the basic rules of family trust had been permanently suspended. 3 days passed in a dense fog of constant anxiety and total insomnia that left me physically and emotionally exhausted. 3 days during which I lived like a tormented fugitive in my own home, avoiding insistent phone calls from Cecilia, who tried to continue our conversation as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and desperately trying to find a viable legal solution to the nightmare that had permanently installed itself in my life like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. During this period of forced isolation, I received daily distressing calls from Ricardo informing me about the progressively worse legal developments of the false accusation, about the growing pressure the company was experiencing from important clients concerned with harassment scandals that could affect corporate reputation, and about the urgent and desperate need to find a concrete way to prove his innocence before his carefully built career over 20 years was completely destroyed by fabricated lies. Each phone call was an additional stab in my already wounded heart, because I felt deeply responsible for the unjust suffering of a man of integrity who was paying a terrible price for my mother's madness. A man who had always treated me with exemplary respect and genuine professional consideration, and who now had his reputation being questioned and his personal life being investigated due to unfounded accusations that could ruin his existence forever. The weight of indirect guilt was almost unbearable, creating a constant pressure in my chest that made me question whether I could emotionally survive this situation. It was Amanda Cristina Mendez, an experienced and respected labor lawyer whom Ricardo hired to defend him from false accusations, who finally gave me a genuine ray of hope by explaining during our first consultation that there were specific and effective legal mechanisms to prove the falsity of the complaint and criminally hold accountable whoever had committed documentary fraud and slander in such an elaborate and systematic manner. When the time came for Cecilia to officially defend herself against the serious accusations weighing against her, she dramatically rose with a carefully rehearsed theatrical posture and began an elaborate and rehearsed speech about how she had acted exclusively out of genuine maternal love, trying to protect a naive and inexperienced daughter from a dangerous sexual predator who was systematically manipulating my young and impressionable mind for his own dubious purposes. Her voice carried an absolute conviction that momentarily made me question whether she actually believed her own lies or if she was simply a consummate actress trying to deceive the court with a convincing performance of a dedicated and misunderstood mother. I know my daughter better than anyone in this courtroom. I instinctively know when she is being manipulated or emotionally exploited, even if she doesn't consciously realize what's happening. A mother always knows when her child is in real danger, she declared with unwavering conviction and dramatic gestures that seemed to come from a poorly rehearsed play. But her words sounded pathetic, narcissistic, and completely disconnected from reality to everyone present who had access to the concrete scientific evidence of her systematic lies. Her criminal defense attorney desperately tried to argue that she had acted under extreme emotional stress, caused by genuine and justified concern for my personal and professional safety, claiming that her actions, although technically incorrect from a legal standpoint, were morally justifiable as acts of instinctive maternal protection against real dangers she perceived in my work environment. He cited legal precedents about temporary mental disturbance, and presented arguments about how maternal love can lead normally rational people to make extreme decisions when they perceive threats against their children. But the judge quickly dismissed this fragile defense when Amanda presented irrefutable evidence of the systematic premeditation and technical sophistication of the crimes committed, demonstrating that Cecilia had acted with full knowledge of the legal consequences of her actions during an extensive period of careful planning. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with palpable tension during this final phase of the trial, with spectators whispering among themselves about the bizarre nature of the case, local journalists taking notes about what would likely become a sensational story in the city newspapers, and court employees observing with morbid fascination a family drama that had escalated to unprecedented legal proportions in their professional experiences. The air conditioning worked monotonously, but the emotional temperature in the room was suffocating, loaded with the density of revelations that were permanently destroying a family and ruining the life of a woman who had chosen the path of criminal manipulation instead of honest dialogue. The sentence was handed down on a rainy and melancholy Thursday afternoon that officially marked the definitive end of the mother-daughter relationship that had been systematically destroyed by Cecilia's deliberate crimes against me and against Ricardo, a relationship that could never be repaired or rebuilt after the fundamental betrayals that had been revealed and documented in court. The judge, demonstrating the seriousness with which he viewed the crimes committed, sentenced her to 3 years in prison in a closed regime for falsification of public documents, 2 additional years for aggravated slander against an innocent person, and 1 more year for systematic ideological falsehood, totaling 6 years of incarceration that she would serve in a closed regime in a state women's penitentiary known for its rigorous discipline and basic but adequate conditions for the rehabilitation of female criminals. Beyond the substantial prison sentence, she was legally obligated to pay substantial monetary compensation to both me and Ricardo for the extensive moral and material damages caused by her calculated crimes, a significant amount that included lost wages during the period of forced unemployment, substantial costs of specialized lawyers, medical expenses for psychological treatment necessary to deal with family trauma, and financial compensation for the intense psychological suffering that her criminal actions had caused to innocent people who trusted her. When I heard the final verdict being read aloud and solemnly by the judicial authority, with each word echoing through the silent room like a hammer hitting the final nail in the coffin of our family relationship, I felt an extremely complex mixture of deep relief, oceanic sadness, and a sense of justice finally being done, because I knew that Cecilia would face the appropriate and proportional legal consequences for her deliberate criminal choices. But I was also losing forever and irreversibly the woman who raised me, educated me, and who should have been my greatest source of unconditional support and maternal protection throughout my life. Ricardo was present at the final hearing, sitting discreetly in the back rows of the room, and approached me after the sentence with genuine tears in his eyes and words of sincere and profound gratitude for having the moral and emotional courage to report my own mother to clear his tarnished name and restore his professional reputation that had been unjustly questioned by elaborate lies. Marina, I know this was the hardest thing you've ever done in your entire life. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for choosing objective truth instead of blind family loyalty, he said with genuine emotion that showed through in every word, offering me a fraternal and respectful hug that I accepted with deep gratitude, feeling that I had finally done the morally right thing even though it cost me my relationship with my mother. When Cecilia was finally taken away by the uniformed court officers with cold handcuffs on her wrists, walking slowly toward the exit of the courtroom with steps that echoed heavily on the marble floor, she turned one last time to look at me across the physical and emotional distance that now permanently separated us. And in her brown eyes that I had known forever, I saw not the maternal remorse that a naive and hopeful part of me still wished to find, nor guilt or regret for the lives she had nearly destroyed with her elaborate lies, but rather a final devastating expression of maternal disappointment and deep bitterness, as if I were the traitorous and ungrateful daughter who had failed her instead of the other way around, as if I were responsible for the destruction of our family instead of the victim of her premeditated crimes. The months that followed the final trial were an intense and challenging period of personal and professional reconstruction that forced me to fundamentally relearn how to live, work, and relate to other people without the toxic but familiar presence of Cecilia, exerting her constant manipulative influence in my life. Each morning was a gradual discovery of who I really was when free from the suffocating expectations, destructive criticism, and obsessive control that had shaped my personality since childhood, a process of self-discovery that was simultaneously liberating and terrifying because it meant rebuilding my identity from scratch. Ricardo generously offered me my job back with a substantial promotion to senior manager and significant salary increase, as fair compensation for the professional and personal trauma I had suffered, officially recognizing my competence and dedication that had been temporarily overshadowed by the family scandal. But I consciously decided that I needed a completely new start at a different company where I could build a career based exclusively on my merit, without the persistent shadows of the family scandal that had marked my previous experience. The search for a new professional opportunity was surprisingly successful when I found an even better position at a renowned international advertising agency, where I could apply all my accumulated experience in coordinating complex projects in a completely new, stimulating, and cosmopolitan environment, surrounded by talented and ambitious colleagues who knew me only as Marina Oliveira Santos, the competent and dedicated professional instead of Marina, the daughter who reported her own mother for federal crimes. The agency's office was modern and inspiring, with panoramic windows offering spectacular views of the city, collaborative spaces that encouraged creativity and innovation, and a corporate culture based on meritocracy and mutual respect that allowed me to flourish professionally in ways I had never imagined possible. During this crucial period of adaptation and growth, I proactively sought specialized psychological help with Dr. Eduardo Silva, an experienced and empathetic therapist specialized in complex family traumas who patiently helped me emotionally process the devastating complexity of having been simultaneously an innocent victim and a necessary whistleblower of my own mother's crimes. His office was a welcoming and safe environment, decorated with soft colors and green plants that created an atmosphere of tranquility and healing, where I could speak openly about my contradictory feelings without fear of judgment or criticism. "You made the morally correct choice by choosing objective truth and legal justice instead of toxic family loyalty that was harming innocent people," he assured me during one of our regular weekly sessions, his carefully chosen words gradually helping me deal with the residual guilt I still occasionally felt for having been responsible for sending Cecilia to prison, even though I rationally knew that her criminal actions had made this consequence inevitable and just. My father, Carlos, who had always been a passive and submissive figure in the family dynamic completely dominated by Cecilia's controlling and authoritarian personality during decades of marriage, finally found moral and emotional courage to seek me out personally and offer sincere apologies for not having noticed, questioned, or prevented her increasingly extreme and dangerous behavior throughout the years leading up to this catastrophe. "Marina, I knew your mother was controlling and possessive. I always knew she interfered too much in your life, but I never imagined in my worst nightmares that she would be capable of reaching this point of deliberate cruelty and criminality. Forgive me for not having adequately protected you from her when I should have noticed the warning signs," he said during an emotional and revealing lunch at a quiet restaurant where we carefully began to rebuild our father-daughter relationship on completely new foundations, far from the toxic and manipulative influence that had dominated our family for longer than either of us would like to admit. Life followed its natural course with gradual but profound changes that allowed me to slowly rediscover who I really was at my most authentic core, when finally free from the constant psychological manipulation and suffocating control that Cecilia had exerted over my existence since the early years of childhood, shaping my personality in ways that I only now began to fully understand. Fernanda Martinez, my best friend since college days and one of the few people who intimately knew the entire story of my dysfunctional family, was absolutely fundamental in this delicate process of emotional recovery and personal reconstruction, offering constant and unconditional emotional support, as well as frequently reminding me of positive qualities and personal strengths that I had completely forgotten I possessed during the years when my self-esteem had been systematically destroyed by subtle but poisonous comments and maternal psychological manipulation disguised as protective love. "Marina, you are more confident, authentic, and genuinely happy than I've seen you in years. It's as if you've finally become the strong and independent person you always were inside, but who was being suffocated by external influences," she observed lovingly during a celebratory dinner among friends on a Friday night, her words making me realize with growing clarity how much I had grown emotionally and psychologically since I definitively freed myself from my mother's destructive influence. I gradually began to build healthier and more balanced relationships, both professional and personal, based on mutual honesty, reciprocal respect, and open communication, instead of subtle manipulation, indirect control, and emotional blackmail disguised as concern, discovering with increasing joy that it was possible to have genuine and meaningful conversations where I could express my opinions, feelings, and ideas without fear of severe judgment, emotional retaliation, or attempts to modify my behavior through guilt or psychological pressure. My new life was being carefully built on solid foundations of genuine self-knowledge and clear, well-defined personal boundaries. A life where I made important decisions based exclusively on my own internal values, personal goals, and authentic dreams, instead of constantly trying to please a maternal figure who would never be truly satisfied with anything I did, no matter how perfectly I tried to meet her impossible and ever-changing expectations. 2 years after the trial that had permanently changed the course of my life, I received an official letter from the Women's Penitentiary where Cecilia was serving her 6-year sentence. A handwritten letter that I read only once with trembling hands before throwing it definitively in the trash without responding, because I immediately realized that she was still trying to manipulate me psychologically through carefully chosen words that mixed fake performative remorse with subtle emotional guilt and attempts to make me feel responsible for her current situation. I consciously choose not to allow her to continue exercising any form of power or influence over my life, even from inside the prison where she is paying for the consequences of her own choices. I firmly told Dr. Silva during our therapy session that memorable week, feeling a powerful sensation of final liberation by making this conscious and definitive decision to completely cut all remaining emotional ties with the woman who had tried to destroy my future, for reasons I would probably never fully understand. Today, 5 years after that devastating confrontation that completely and irreversibly changed the course of my existence, I can say with absolute certainty and genuine pride that reporting my own mother for her serious crimes was simultaneously the most difficult and emotionally painful decision, but also the most liberating and morally correct one I have ever made in my entire adult life. I built a solid and respected career based exclusively on genuine merit, professional dedication and technical competence instead of family manipulation or personal favors, developed authentic and meaningful relationships based on mutual respect, reciprocal trust, and honest communication, and mainly, learned to completely trust my own judgment about people and situations without allowing external voices to distort my perception of reality or influence my important decisions through fear, guilt, or emotional blackmail. Ricardo became not just a respected colleague and valuable professional mentor, but also a dear and trustworthy friend who occasionally invites me to cheerful family barbecues at his suburban home, where I can directly observe and learn through example what it means to have a genuinely healthy and functional family, where love is expressed through unconditional support instead of control, where communication is direct and honest instead of manipulative and indirect, and where each member is respected as a unique individual instead of treated as an extension of others' expectations. My father Carlos and I rebuilt our relationship on a completely new and much healthier foundation, based on honest conversations about the painful past we shared and genuine hopes for a better future. Far from the toxic atmosphere that Cecilia had created and maintained in our home during decades of controlling behavior that we had all accepted as normal for lack of external perspective, Fernanda continues to be my closest and most loyal confidant, always lovingly reminding me that true strength and authentic courage sometimes mean making extremely painful decisions that protect not only ourselves, but also innocent people who may be harmed by those who claim to love us, but demonstrate that love in destructive and harmful ways. Continued therapy with Dr. Silva taught me valuable lessons about healthy relationships, including the fundamental understanding that true and genuine love never requires us to sacrifice our personal integrity, our moral honesty, or to allow others to commit serious crimes in our name. A precious lesson that I carry with me and apply in all aspects of my personal and professional life. When I look back today, to that terrible and transformative morning when I discovered the crimes that Cecilia had committed against me and Ricardo, I no longer feel the intense anger that initially consumed me, nor the oceanic sadness that threatened to drown me in the first months after the trial, but rather a deep and lasting gratitude for having found within myself the moral and emotional strength necessary to do the right thing, even when it was simultaneously the most difficult and painful decision I could make. Sometimes, truly protecting those we love means protecting them from the destructive consequences of their own behavior, when that behavior becomes criminal and harmful to innocent people. I frequently reflect with wisdom acquired through suffering, knowing that this painful but valuable lesson transformed me into a significantly stronger, wiser, more empathetic person, more capable of building and maintaining genuinely healthy relationships based on solid foundations of honesty, respect, and unconditional love that does not require submission or silence in the face of injustice. Did you like Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.